right? Praise God. Once again, let's call Jeremiah chapter 17, serve or servitude, in this chapter that starts off with the first four, or at least the first two verses, talking about the way that the sins of Judah are engraved with a pen of iron and a point of diamond on the hearts of the people. Verses 3 and 4 going on to say that the price of their sin is the decline of their heritage and the rise of their servitude to their enemies. Thus, the title, God repaying them in kind for the way in which, once again, they voluntarily served other gods. He is now repaying them with that by sending them into the servitude of foreign nations with foreign gods. As verses 5 through 13 are going to issue a series of warnings, not unlike the Proverbs, starting out with, cursed is the man who trusts in man, who makes flesh his strength and whose heart turns from God. In contrast, blessed is the man who trusts in God, and similar to Psalm 1 is going to say, is one who is planted like a tree by steady streams of water, who inherits essentially blessings that last or have an endurance that go far beyond the advantages that can be gained by people pleasing, or the kind of servitude that goes along with making flesh our trust, or making people our God, for lack of a better term. Going on, he's going to say that the heart is deceitful above all things, in the famous passage that goes on to say, God searches the heart and he tests the mind to give everyone according to their ways. Going on, he will say that riches without justice are folly. Once again, they produce the kind of gains that do not endure. Finally saying in that section, a glorious throne is what God has prepared for his people. However, those who turn from him should not expect him to look out for them. Understanding, he's not necessarily talking about openly turning from God as much as he is talking about turning from God in practice, even while maintaining the formality of professing loyalty to God, as we saw in Isaiah and early on in Jeremiah. Verses 14 through 18, giving us another aside where Jeremiah seems to address God directly, saying, heal me and I shall be healed. Save me and I will be saved. They say, seeming to refer to his adversaries, where's the word of the Lord? Bring it. We want to hear more. Seeming to mock him, as we recall from chapters, I think it was 11 and 12, maybe 10, 11 and 12. But the mocking is not deterring him, because he is relying on his record when he says, I have not run from my responsibilities. My paraphrase, you know, God, what I have said. You please be my refuge. Similar to what we saw again in the Psalms, as David frequently requested that God would be his refuge. This time Jeremiah is saying, as for my persecutors, destroy them with double destruction and let them be the ones who actually find shame. While God, I pray for you to vindicate me. Verses 19 through 27, a relatively lengthy passage that I'm going to sum up briefly by saying, God, at least at this point, is calling him to stand by the people's gate and only require them to remember the Sabbath. Of course, that's not the whole of the law, but sometimes, as it is said, a journey of, I think it is 1,000 miles, starts with a single step. Understanding that God is not summarizing the entire law through Jeremiah. He is, at this point, quite possibly at least offering them the kind of step that would open him up to, as he has already promised, forgiving and completely restoring them. Verse 23, however, saying they would not listen. God still concluding that if you restore the Sabbath, or your reverence for the Sabbath, you will be restored. But if not, he is going to burn the land with a fire that cannot be quenched. This chapter quite possibly giving us yet another perspective on the idolatry that is leading them off into captivity. Getting a chance, or we got a chance a few chapters back to see that the narrative thing wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The priests were armed with a lying pen, heavily involved in crafting a narrative that allowed the people to essentially do whatever they wanted in the name of God. Here, instead of shifting their loyalties to a narrative, God seems to warn of the danger in shifting their loyalties to people. As we have mentioned before, falling into the trap of people pleasing, something it can be easy to do in the workplace, in school, or just in a social environment that we crave to be a part of or desperately want to be a part of. Understanding that admission or the price of admission into certain networks can come at a cost we aren't necessarily willing to pay if we think it through to the end. Famous preacher or a famous saying from an older, wiser preacher goes, sin typically, if not always, takes you further than you wanted to go, keeps you longer than you wanted to stay, and costs you more than you'd like to pay. That saying in this chapter reminds me that even though our affection for people will never make them a God, too much reverence to an individual can cause God to turn you over to them in a level of servitude that might as well make them your God.